Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one absentee chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we are going to get this party started. So first we're going to say that Nick has not made his wife disappear. She is not, with the waste management, swimming with the fishes or nothing. I promise. She's just unpacking, and he got a break to talk to me. So you're welcome. One of these days, she'll keep you working, and she's going to come visit me instead.
Yeah, it's going to be probably late June is when the doctor says you're good to go back to full duty. So until then, I'm just getting my butt kicked in physical therapy.
Always fun. Doctors are mean. I think they're all sadists.
Yeah, I thought you meant you were going to be in packing until June, and I'm like, oh man,
that would be rough. The doctors at Walter Reed that did the physical rehab for me, I think they were sadists. They were evil people.
Yeah, they always smile when they make you do the weirdest stuff. Like, hey, we want you to balance on your bad leg and stretch this leg out, but that's only for support and balance. But most of the up and down is going to be with that really weak leg that we see trembling all the time.
Yeah,
I'm like, none of that sounds good.
The more it hurts, the more they smile, which is a sign that they're evil people.
yeah.
Dude,
Oh, yeah.
do squat lunges across this football field, please, with your reconstructed knee. Yeah.
But
All
only
right.
with the one leg.
So this is the part, dear listener, dear viewer at home, where we'll let every one of our lovely guests introduce themselves. And because I use the oracle known as Words alphabetical sorter, we're going to let Mr. David Wise introduce himself.
Well, greetings all. It's nice to be together with you and to see my good friends, Jim and Lester and Steve, albeit virtually only. I worked at TSR from 1991 until 97, and then went out to Seattle as part of the Wizards of the Coast staff. I began as an editor, began designing along the way because that's what TS editors inevitably end up doing. Eventually worked my way into product line management. I was heavily involved with the Ravenloft line. I was the original editor on the first Planescape box set. A lot of interesting credits that I'm very proud of. And then towards the end of TSR's reign, Jim graciously asked me to be his sidekick, his number one. I was the director of creative services for the last year and a half or so before TSR was sold to Wizards of the Coast.
As part of the prep for this, when I was getting all the links together, I looked at the TSR wiki page, and man, you guys had a lot of games I'd never even realized. Everyone thinks TSR, and they just think Dungeons and Dragons. There was a lot more than that on that list.
Oh, yes.
Sure is.
Some of your tabletop war games, like with the Blood and Bayonet, I think it was, the Civil War Battle of Antietam one. I'm like, man, I wonder if I can buy that. That looks cool. All right, James, you frequent guest of the show, but can you please introduce yourself again to anyone who's living under a rock and hasn't been listening to our other episodes?
Yeah, okay. James M. Ward here. I started at TSR in 1980, did a couple things there, left a couple times, and in 1997 I started working for other people for better money, and I have a pretty good reputation for getting things done early.
Outstanding. All right, next we got Mr. Lester Smith.
Hey, gang. I worked TSR from 91, I think, to 95, 96. Mainly known for Dragon Dice there, and which won an Origins Award the year it was out, so that was pretty cool. Before that, I worked for GDW full-time and did a lot of freelance work for some other companies, but yeah, that's pretty much me. Nowadays, I'm self-publishing things for the fun of it and having a good time. Retired.
You're doing some pretty great game designs, Lester.
Thanks.
Fun is a noble goal. Life is bleak enough as it is. You don't need to look for more. So I'm all about fun. So, and finally, we have Mr. Steven Sullivan.
Hey guys, it's good to be here. I started work at TSR in 1982, 1980 as well. Sometime, probably 6 months after Jim, I'm guessing. I was in September. Jim, when were you?
I was 1980. I was June.
June, yes. You were just a couple of months ahead of me on staff there. I started as an editor, and I worked on everything. I worked on the Dungeons and Dragons Basic and Expert. I worked on the first Gamma World and Top Secret modules, the first revision of Top Secret. And then I moved into the art department. I worked on even more stuff. I was there until 1984. I worked on original Dragonlance stuff. I wrote the ads for Dungeons and Dragons that appeared in Marvel Comics that people remember really fondly. Then I went to work at Pacesetter, which was the original creators of Chill. And then in 1986, when that folded, I became freelance and went back to working for TSR and other companies. I did some comic books I worked for all the major comic book companies. I did a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And eventually I meandered into novels, where I wrote a bunch of Legend of the Five Rings books. I did some Dragonlance, and I wrote the adaptation of the first Iron Man movie for kids, the junior novel. So I've had this really.
Wait, what about the Hardy Boys stuff?
Well, yeah, I wrote the Boy Detectives in a series that I am legally not supposed to name.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
But that's okay, Jim. I've been out it online, and I did write 14 books in that particular series, including the last book in the original Boy Detective series.
I was so envious of you doing that work.
It was a blast. If they hadn't been sold to another big company that gobbled them up and fired my editors, I might still be writing that stuff. I loved that. It was great fun.
Cool.
Okay.
Let's hope I didn't put you in jail, Stephen.
No, I don't even think the people that own that property now probably have any idea who worked on it in the past. And the chances of them seeing this podcast, well, maybe they're great. Maybe millions of people will see this and they'll go, get Sullivan's contract and fire him.
Yeah.
Well, too late, guys.
I'll just point out you didn't actually mention it. So you're still good. Just because Jim said Hardy Boys, or I say Hardy Boys, or anybody else here says Hardy Boys.
Somebody say Hardy Boys?
Yeah. Right. Well done,
And I
David.
just worked on the Boy Detectives, whoever they might be.
Yes, okay.
Well, as long as the checks keep cashing, you do whatever you got to do.
Yeah, I wish. That was one of my ongoing fights with them. Was I wanted credit and some kind of a back end would have been nice, but. If you've ever worked freelance as a novelist, and I know Jim has at least.
Yeah, nobody wants to give you a back end of anything.
Got that right.
Except
Yeah, that's very true. I've done some ghostwriting too, and the NDAs generally are pretty ironclad.
Yep, they are.
So, although it sounds like your ghostwriting was a lot more respectable than mine, so good for you.
Well, you'd be surprised what other things I've ghostwritten, maybe.
I'm not saying it was Yetis, but I'm not saying it either.
Yeah, really.
Although,
occasionally I get a check from a couple of comic book companies, and they're usually around 30 to 60 cents. So I feel like I made it.
I actually get paid by Watsy just this month.
You have
really surprising because
first 28-cent check, I'll tell you.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I waited 2 years, I could probably get a cup of coffee.
There we go.
my favorite was I actually had a check that was 25 cents from one of the small publishers I worked for, and when I took it into the bank to cash it because I didn't know how to do it on my phone yet, it bounced.
Oh my god!
It's not going to last long, and I didn't even worry about it. They can have the 25 cents.
As a freelancer in gaming, I had many checks that bounced. I used to have one account that would regularly send me bad checks and then hope that they could get me a good one before the first one bounced.
Oh my.
That was not what I'd call fun. I hope I'm the only one here that had that experience, but probably all of us have.
With modern electronics, kids these days will never know the adrenaline rush of hoping to beat the check to the bank as you're writing checks before your paycheck gets there.
Yeah.
Yep. Right.
So, All right, so before we get started, we do have to do the religion question. It is sort of par for the course for the Blasters and Blades. So since you were last talking, Steve, we're going to ask you first. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Star Trek, original Star Trek series. I love the other two, but Jim Kirk and Spock and McCoy and all that crew, they're in my blood.
Okay. Lester, all right, same question. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
All of the above for different reasons.
It's an acceptable answer, sir. All right, David, what about yourself, sir?
I love them all as well, but I would have to say that I am a Trekkie.
Okay, it's acceptable. Which series was it? Was it the original series?
Well, I'm old enough to have seen the original series first run, and then reruns ad nauseum through the years through that. But it was TNG that hooked me completely, and to this day, I still am a Jean-Luc Picard fan. When you ask who's my favorite captain, it's going to be Picard.
I always liked Captain Archer. The Enterprise.
Oh yeah, from Enterprise.
Yeah.
I think he was a good mix between the two.
In my head canon,
the only one I didn't see every episode of, I think, and I got mad at them for a reason I don't remember. My wife will remember. And watch the last season, maybe the last.
In my head canon, Quantum Leap's last jump was into Captain Archer. So.
There we go.
James,
all right, James. Oh, that's a good one too.
For me, it's Firefly because the babes are hotter.
Some things never change, James. All right, and because we are polytheistic, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia, James?
You know, I had to work on two of those collectible card games, which really soured me on both of them. So I'm going to take Narnia.
Okay. All right, what about you, David?
Going to have to go with Narnia as well. I'm a classic literature student, studied English lit all the way through college. And so I turned on to Lewis and Tolkien early.
Excellent choices. Lester, what about yourself, sir?
Magicians. That trilogy of novels beats out everything else, including Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. I have some issues with Narnia. Wonderful stuff, but I have some issues with the mythology of it.
So the Chronicles of Narnia gets a nod and somewhat of an inspiration, it looks like, if you read The Magician with Filigree, is basically Narnia.
Oh, yeah, clearly.
And I just watched the series because I found it on Netflix, and I'm like, I've got to read these books now because it was awesome.
The books are...
I'm sure normally the books are even better. So, okay. What about you, Steve?
I'm going to disagree with Lester on that book, but we don't have to go further than that. I didn't like the book. I think the series is fine. I haven't read The Wheel of Time. I like the Amazon series. Game of Thrones I love, but I fear that he will never finish it. And who knows where we go from there. So I'm going to go with Narnia too, which seems to be a consensus pick. Lester aside here.
I'm convinced Brandon Sanderson is going to write the ending for Game of Thrones.
I'm sorry, who's going to write the ending?
Brandon Sanderson.
Brandon Sanderson.
He works for Robert.
Yeah.
So. All right, and so because
JR, I want to hear what the two sponsors think too.
What's that?
I want to hear what the two sponsors think. What do you and you two think?
I like Chronicles of Narnia. And if it was the old list, I'd say the Tolkien, because I grew up on The Hobbit. So that was my first introduction to fantasy. So, but of the list as given, I would say Narnia. I don't like grimdark, and Robert Jordan's writing just didn't speak to me. I tried to get into it; it just wasn't my style.
Yeah.
What about you, Nick?
For me, I like the series, the on-film adaptation of anyway, my final answer is Narnia. Game of Thrones was cool. The book
now,
was,
I'm assuming
was great,
that you disqualified Tolkien because everyone said Tolkien?
Yes.
No, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, actually. It's probably one of the first fantasy books that I ever read. Because comic book nerds, we're all in the same circles. We're all into pretty much the same stuff. And then someone had read Tolkien, like, hey, man, have you ever read Lord of the Rings? And I'm like, the hell is that? And they're like, oh, dude. And they're like super stoked and like hard sell me on it. Like, dude, I'll bring it to school tomorrow, dude, and you just let me know what you think. I'm like, okay. And I read it. I'm like, man, this stuff's cool.
I had your first experience, yeah.
Steve,
First one's always free, man.
Yeah. So yes, we had Tolkien on the original list, and everyone would say it, and it got monotonous to the point where the fans were like, "I know exactly what their answer is going to be." So the requirement was it had to be across multiple genres. So it was it in film? Was it in book? Was it in others? So that way, readers and consumers of the products could come where they were. Because there's lots of really good fantasy books out there that never made it to the screen, so some people don't know about them, which is sad. But
the thing is, at the end of the day, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steven.
When you rotate something out, you should put in Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy.
Yeah, I would have picked that.
Which I think after Tolkien, that's my top one.
I shall write that down. And while I'm writing that down, we're going to ask the next question, inspired by James. It's all his fault. But what's your favorite dinosaur, Steve?
Ooh, I've loved dinosaurs literally as long as I can remember. And I'm as tempted as I am to go with the Trachodon, I'm going to say the Triceratops. I know that's kind of mainstream, but I loved it when I was a kid. I still love them.
Good choice.
Okay. Steve, Lester?
Ankylosaurus.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another of my faves, yeah.
Something
Classics.
about that spiky turtle kind of with the big bony ball on the end of the tail.
That's right up there for me as well. All right, David.
When I was a kid, I loved reading about George the Shy Stegosaurus.
Okay. And James.
Dear to my heart. I'm a Stego fan.
I put a Tyrannosaurus Rex in every single one of my products.
Okay.
Go wrong with T-Rex.
So did you love
giant ape in a boy detective story once?
So James, did you like watching Jurassic Park the first time seeing it on the big screen like that?
I was enchanted. I liked all of them, even though the stories are kind of lame.
Basically, they're all the same story, every new version, but it's going to work this time, honest.
Yeah, really.
But I still read them because dinosaurs. All right. So last time we answered this, I told you I like the Triceratops and the Stegosaurus. And just to break it up, my third favorite is the pterodactyl. Because flying is cool. I want to be able to fly someday.
Oh, we get third options now?
Well, we've answered before, so we get to give our third favorite now.
Pteranodons are high on my list, too. So
I'm surprised nobody mentioned the Velociraptor.
That is up there.
We're all
once we
old.
found out that Velociraptors, there was a difference between a Utah Raptor and a regular Velociraptor.
Yeah,
Once
those
I
guys
learned
were
that-
only discovered in like the 1970s.
You know, it was like learning Santa's not real. It was like,
Wait, Santa's not real?
Yeah.
Since when?
oh my God, nobody told me.
No, the Velociraptor's about the size of a chicken.
Yeah,
Utah
Oh,
Raptors are
yes.
the big ones.
yeah.
So did all of these dinosaur fans ever? Oh, Nick, you didn't answer yet.
What?
Did you say your third?
Oh, it's a toss-up between pterodactyl and Dilophosaurus.
Okay. So did you guys get into, before we start talking about the subject that brought us here, did you guys get into that show Primeval, where there were like time anomalies and dinosaurs would come into modern times?
That was fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my wife has got me started watching that. I'm sorry, you mentioned Jurassic Park, and Jim, I'm with you. All the movies have something going for them, but that moment in the first movie where the brontosauruses were out, for someone our age, I would say there are two moments in film that were just like, oh my God, they've brought my childhood onto the big screen. I'm no longer a nerd. One of them was the twin suns rising on Tatooine or setting on Tatooine, and the other one was that big brontosaurus, and you could see all the other dinosaurs. It was just movie magic.
Yeah.
That's the cool thing is with all the interviews, when we get to talk to people of the generation before us and hear their stories about, like, we interviewed one author who was at Annapolis when the first movie came out and how he went AWOL to go sneak into the theaters to watch that movie.
Oh, my.
And then he snuck back on base because he had to see it in person. Like those kind of experiences. Oh, they're golden.
I did that with the first Avengers movie.
Oh, really?
Is the statute of limitations out for you, Nick? Are we good?
No, because I went with my CEO. I convinced him to come with.
All right. All right. And the
Excellent.
last and most important religion question, because we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes, we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters Blades podcast. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it, Steven?
I didn't used to drink coffee until I had a job that had a free latte machine. And
Nice.
so now I occasionally drink coffee. I've always liked tea. I like it English style, but my favorite thing by far in that range is boba tea. And I'm talking about tapioca boba tea, not this fruity crap. I'm talking about matcha or one of the chais or some kind of straightforward tea with bubbles in it. Tapioca.
I like
bubbles.
tea with a little danger to it because you might choke on one of the boba balls.
Absolutely.
We actually started asking this question when I found the Tea and Metals channel on YouTube. It's this guy is a former British soldier who interviews British troops that won various medals of valor. And so his opening question was, how do they take their tea? And I was shocked to how many ways you could take tea, because in the South it is sweet and iced, and that is the only way to drink it.
My wife won't drink sweet tea at all, and I like almost every kind of tea I've tried. Sweet tea, straight up, whatever.
Are you sure your wife has not been cloned by some alien force or something? Because I mean, that's just the only way to drink it.
Possible.
Yeah, I got to go half and half on the sweet tea.
We're half Swedes, so
Okay. I don't want to
Swedes
upset
they have coffee.
They're also very particular about how you make sweet tea. It has to be prepared just so.
Absolutely. All right. So, Lester, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Oh, it was coffee, the darkest possible coffee, until I got my anxiety depression diagnosis, and they said cut down the caffeine. Tea has a different kind of caffeine, and man, I love Earl Grey.
It's a very tasty tea. Can't go wrong.
Good tea. It's good tea.
Earl Grey, hot. All
Yep,
right.
Yes.
and sweet.
David, what about yourself? Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Never learned to drink coffee. If it tasted like it smelled, I would drink it. If I taste it, it's a lie.
Yeah.
David, all you have to do is put a lot of milk and sugar in it, which
Yeah,
is the way I take it.
Not really
Yeah.
coffee
Or sweet,
anymore.
whatever your sweetener is. Now it's
Yeah,
milk.
yeah. No, my thing is English tea with lemon, hot or cold. No sugar.
Okay. James, what about you, sir?
I've actually discovered hibiscus tea, and I gave you a bunch of it for Christmas, as a matter of fact.
It was good, but my mom stole most of it, but it was good.
The nice thing about it for me is I don't have to sweeten it at all. It tastes sweet all by itself.
Back before they went under, when I was in grad school, I used to go to Tea Havana, it's like a Starbucks kind of company, but it was tea only. And they had one tea, it was a peppermint and something that tasted like big red gum. It was like the best tea I've ever had, but I've never found a replacement once they went under.
Uh-huh.
David,
So-
I would recommend, and I tried this the other day for the very first time. I had an actual espresso at a coffee shop, one of those little like Italian cups with the espresso was so dark that it was so flavorful. I didn't want any sweetener in it, just drinking it as it was. You might find that actually tastes the way it smells.
Interesting.
The most unique experience I had with those tiny teacups like that was I went to a chocolatier with the wife, and they had European sipping chocolate, which we thought would be just like regular hot chocolate, but it was like basically liquid fudge, and it was so sweet. Like I took a sip and I was done. I'm like, nope, can't do it.
Like Willy Wonka, like that kind of chocolatier.
They make their own chocolates and then they sell them, and they make it on site.
Oh my god!
Yeah.
It's cool.
I'm just learning about this now.
It's all pizza and brats here.
Only wonderful thing that us diabetics only have to have in tiny
Yeah, really.
every once in a great while.
Or take extra insulin.
Well, see, I'm a recovering fatty now, so I don't enjoy all that flavorful food anymore. I count the calories, but
You enjoy it, you just don't ingest it.
yes, there we go. But at the rate I'm going, my doctor swears I'll fit back into my dress uniforms at Christmas. And so I figure I'll grow out my full beard. Like I'll go like full Duck Dynasty. I'm going to put my dress blues back on, take a picture, and I'm going to mail it to my first sergeant. Like, how's my mustache hair now? Huh?
Oh, cool.
It's going to be
You can
tickly
do it, man.
and
Stay away from the
irritating.
carbs.
Yeah,
Stay away from the carbs. I've lost 30 pounds in the last 6 months.
Congratulations.
wow.
Yeah,
Without
that
drugs.
makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Same.
I've dropped 50 pounds in the last 5 or 6 years.
Jeez.
Well done. See, that's the inspiration I needed. Thank you. Thank you. All right. And so now that we got that out of the way, which is the fun part where we got to know you as nerds. So you all obviously came in to TSR in the early days, but how did you, and at this point, just kind of round robin it as far as answers, how did you first hear of TSR to get the job in the first place? Were you all just local to Geneva?
No, I was. I lived out in the Boston area, and I lived in a small town called Sharon, which is right next to Foxborough, where the Patriots play. And the nerds per capita in Sharon are probably greater than anywhere else on Earth. I mean, if you didn't go to Harvard or MIT or Caltech or something like that, you were slumming. I didn't. I was slumming. So probably either in 74 or 75, someone in my high school got D&D and started playing it. I didn't play it until 77, right at the start of 77, because I was a Tolkien purist, and I wasn't going to play this game that was bastardizing Professor Tolkien's work. So, but the lure was there, and then I discovered in 77 or 76, I guess, that one of the PMs had a really, really cute sister.
Oh, there we go.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. There it is.
And so my unique story is I started playing D&D to meet girls, and it totally worked.
I mean, you're married, so well done. You
Right.
succeeded.
Well, and my wife's been playing since what, 78, huh? 79. So
I would call that counterintuitive.
we take the wins where we can get them, David.
Take the W's where you can, kid. Take the W's where you can.
Yeah.
right.
What-
So D&D culture was in my town, and through that I discovered Dragon magazine. And Dragon, back in the day, they used to run contests, and they ran a Draw the Monster contest based on a Fritz Leiber paragraph, and I placed third in that, actually ahead of Errol Otis, which still blows my mind.
Oh, cool.
Well done.
Congrats.
And then they had a dungeon design contest, and I placed second in that. And that and persistence, when TSR would say, "Hey, we're hiring," which they were in 1980, as Jim knows, I would send them my little resume. And at one point, I taught D&D at MIT, so that probably helped. It was high school. It was college classes for high school students, and my friend Marty, who later went to went to Caltech, worked at IBM, and invented that little bar that you would use that had this much time remaining until you have to put the next disk in for Windows. Marty invented that for IBM. Anyway, he and I taught this class on D&D at MIT. So eventually all that stuff added up. And so when they were hiring people, they didn't hire me when they hired Jim. They hired me at the end of that summer.
My experience with computers is I broke the computer lab and was told to never come back. And I didn't know, don't even know how I did it, but oops.
We used to play Zork at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab the night before we would teach class. We'd go in there at night, and we had to go in at night because only 3 people could play Zork on the entire mainframe at MIT that was being spied on by the CIA, or the whole system went down. So we could only play it late at night, Friday nights, and then we'd play all night and then go and teach class in the morning.
And now we all have these.
Yeah, I would almost pay to read the CIA notes. Like, damn kids are at it again.
Yeah.
It would have been funny.
I got to say that this podcast has already been more than worth it just to learn more details about my buddy Steve Sullivan. Wow. You've done things.
Notice that he didn't mention in his accolades professor at MIT.
Yeah, really.
It was just for high school students. It was it was not a real professorship. I was
I would leave that part out and just say professor.
Yeah.
But I believe that Marty and I were the first people to teach D&D at any college or university anywhere. So
That
I will
sounds
vouch
like
for
it.
that.
Yeah. I think you asked me. So it was 1980 before I even discovered Dungeons and Dragons. It was someone at church who I barely knew invited me to come and play. And the original D&D, I think we played once because the dungeon master could barely figure out what is this game all about.
Ah, there we go.
Right. And I remember that first adventure. I wish I could remember the character that I was playing. So just, because your very first character, it ought to be important. All I remember is we were raiding a giant's cave, killed the giant, and one of my buddies was so greedy, he just wouldn't leave it alone. He was searching this, searching that. He searched the giant's pockets, and the DM had a giant tick beat him.
Well done.
We started playing AD&D immediately after that. Played for 2 solid years. I kind of pushed the dungeon master out of his chair and ran it. Then I will say that Gary's dice charts in the original DMG, I think, had a profound effect on my career. As I said, the thing I'm best known for is Dragon Dice, of course, and my approach to role-playing games in general is really below the surface is this precise mechanical system, the way that a poem has a structure. So then ended up in college in about 30 and started pre-med, went into English about halfway through, got a professional practice gig at GDW, who are best known for Traveler. And that turned into a full-time job there, which then one of my buddies started working at TSR, one of my buddies from GDW, and told me that they were hiring. So I ended up there. Can I take the time to tell you about meeting Jim Ward for my
God.
For my interview?
Absolutely.
Here it comes.
So yeah, Tim Brown was the guy who told me the first time that they were hiring. Get your resume in. So I sent a resume up, and I didn't hear from them for a year. I thought, well, that they must not have liked what I've been doing or whatever. And then he called and said, you need to get up here right away for an interview. So I went up for an interview, and my dear friend Jim, dear friend now, the guy I never didn't know, took me around showing me the facility and each of the places he had been working when the layoff of such and such a year came through and he lost his job. And I thought, you're trying to convince me to work here? Your big things are that you got laid off. And so
what
he made
year
me
was
an
that,
offer.
Lester?
That would have been about
April
80,
4th, 1984.
Was it 84? Really?
The day that will live in infamy.
Oh,
No,
that's
when he got nuked.
Right. No, my interview would have been about 86, 87.
Okay.
And I had finished the degree and was halfway through. I think I had 6 weeks left of grad school. And when I asked, okay, so do I have time to finish this off? Nope, we need you right now. Okay, can you budge a little bit on the salary? Nope, this is what it is. Okay, well, I write poems, and apparently when I put pen to paper, TSR owns it. So, yep, that's the way it is. So I said, no, thanks. And
I had a
that was
discussion with Jim that went like that too.
Yeah, so it was a year later that Tim called me again, and I went up and got the same interview with the same, showing the same desks. God, I love you, Jim. It's a wonderful story, I think. And we got back to the office, and he made me an offer, and I was stunned by how much it was. And I sat there in silence for a moment, taking it in, and he said, "Okay, we'll raise it to," and it was an even higher number. Yep, done. So
I was such a pushover in those days.
Yeah, well,
God bless you, because God knows the executives didn't need that money.
Yeah,
that was part of what made it not just bearable. That's part of what made it wonderful working at TSR for those years, though, was Jim was very much a buffer between creative services and the business side of things. So we could
that was
play
constantly
and
a problem
write
at
with
TSR.
joy.
Our managers were wonderful. The guys above our managers,
yeah.
not so wonderful most of the time.
A lot of politics going on up there.
Yep.
After a while, I got called a ranger protecting the hobbits.
Yep. And that's what it felt like.
It, man.
Yep.
And then David, how about you when you came to TSR?
Well, I just finished my master's degree, and I was planning on going on for my doctorate. And I went out and got drunk with my major advisor.
As one does.
And as one does, that's right. And after we had a few drinks under his belt, he said, "Dave, I've known you for about 8 years now, and I know that you have sort of a natural resistance to bullshit. And I got to tell you that professional school is just nothing but bullshit. It's kissing the right butts. It's hanging out in the right circles. You're going to hate it. But if you want to really teach college English and creative writing, then go out into the real world, get yourself a job as an editor somewhere, publish some books. And then if you want to come back to academia, colleges love to hire published authors and give them instructor contracts." What I didn't know was that he very much regretted his choice to stay in academia. So he gave the same advice to all of his favorite students, knowing that once they went out in the world, they would never come back again. So the next Sunday evening, I was playing D&D with my regular group, which included a woman named Ann Brown, who is an editor at TSR. And after I recounted the story, she said, "Well, why don't you come to work at TSR?" And I thought, well, that sounds great. This was in Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Lake Geneva is a little less than an hour away. I don't have to move to New York or anything like that. I'll send in my resume. And Jim, I don't think I ever told you this, but a few weeks later, Ann called me and she said, "I just came from Jim's office. He's got your resume on the desk in front of him. Call him now."
Nice.
Oh, God bless Ann. Ann is one of the great people.
Yeah, look, wondering how things are coming along. And he goes, "Oh, you know what? I was just looking at your resume. Why don't you come on down for an interview?"
Ann got her start in games playtesting for Pacesetter when I was at Pacesetter. So I've known her long time. And I love her. She's a wonderful woman.
Yeah, Ann is tops. Still close with her to this day.
That's crazy to think about. Like, the odds that she thought to call you, and then you happen to be by your phone because you couldn't take it with you. I mean, like, it's the hand of fate almost, because people the people listening might not remember the time when the phone was chained to a wall.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got a couple jobs as freelance. I did a couple of freelance jobs and did a pretty good job with them, because when Karen Boomgarden, who is the freelance coordinator back there, called me to offer me another job, I said, "Sorry, I can't take it. I've been offered a full-time position there." And she's like, oh, okay. Well, great.
Cool. Another great person at TSR. TSR, the people that TSR hired into its creative division were almost uniformly great people. I mean, I'm friends with, I don't know, 2 generations or maybe 3 generations of creative people from TSR, starting with, the generation, Gary's generation, and then going on. And, every time people talk about these folks, I'm like, oh yeah, I know them. I love that guy. I love that woman. They're awesome. And
Well, it was glorious working with those people and gaming all the time.
Yes.
Between lunch hours and gaming 4 or 5 nights a week with the people you worked with. It was
We were
wonderful.
professional children.
Exactly. Yep.
What about you, James? How did you first get into, hear about TSR and then get hired?
Okay, so I met Gary, and he taught me how to play D&D. But I have a wonderful David Wise story I'd like to tell you.
Oh my.
Okay.
So it was the dark times at TSR, and everybody and their mother was getting fired. And Dave saw the handwriting on the wall. And so I had started a little company called Fast Forward, and we were selling like 5 or 6 products a year. And David said, "Hey, would you like me to come work for you guys?" And I have to tell you, I had the highest respect for David, and I really wanted him to come work for us. But I knew we'd be little for a long time. And so I said, if you can find someplace better, you should go. And it was the toughest thing I ever told anybody. I didn't want him to go, but I just for his own sake, I had to tell him. So, and he did.
Fast Forward produced some great stuff.
Story. When Wizards of the Coast, Peter Atkinson called me, invited me to lunch. And when I went into him, I said, I'm not here for a job because I was already working with Jim and that's where I wanted to be. But I'm here because I don't think you got the straight story on the staff. I was basically the staff director for the last couple of years at TSR. And I wanted Peter to understand who was who on that staff, who had the talents, the greatest talents, and where their strengths were, those kinds of things. I wanted to take care of my staff. And he said, well, does that mean that you wouldn't accept a job if I offered it to you? I said, well, why don't you tell me a little bit about Wizards of the Coast? And for 2 hours, he went on to tell me about Wizards of the Coast and his philosophy of management and, how he thought a business should be run. And I eventually said, you know what? This is a really interesting company. I could work for this man. And he took me back to, excuse me, to TSR with him. And in the past, under former management, you needed an escort and you needed to sign in at the front desk and, with high security kind of stuff. Peter said, all right, we'll go have fun, go see everybody. He turned around and he just left me there. And I just walked around the building and then got his secretary came and found me and said, Peter would like you to come down to the boardroom. So I went down there and there was a big group of managers there and they had a meeting and Peter didn't say anything until the end of the meeting. He said, oh, by the way, David, it's great to have you back on staff. So that was how I knew I'd been rehired. So I went to Jim just torn about the whole thing. I said, Jim, I don't know what to do. Wizards of the Coast has offered me a job. And Jim said, I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to take that job and you're going to move to Seattle and you're going to be the successful man that I know you are.
Awesome.
It's one of the most beautiful things that anybody have done for me. And I love Jim with all my heart.
I'm kind of fond of David too.
So how did you find TSR? I mean, obviously you lived near enough to Gary that you were able to go into a game store and meet him and learn. But how did you know that store was there, that game existed? Like, how did you first find D&D, I guess, or whatever it was at the time?
Sure. So it was 1974. Every Tuesday, I went into the Lake Geneva Smoke Shop because they got science fiction and fantasy novels.
Is that the one that was next to the theater, Jim?
Yes, that's exactly right. And so I'm in there and I'm grabbing novels. They were 95 cents a piece. So you could buy a lot of novels in those days. And And so this rough trucker looking guy was right beside me. And he had ripped blue jeans and he had a blue jean jacket. And he had one of these weird wallets with the great big long chain that trucker guys have. And he had a scruffy beard and he was half bald. And when we both got done picking up books, we had the exact 7 books in our hands, which we thought was hysterical. And we started talking, and he said that he had a game where I could play Conan the Barbarian and fight Set. And I was just hooked like a fish. I went to his house a couple weeks later. He and Brian Bloom taught me how to play the game. And then I started suggesting products to him. And he had no idea if I could write, but he was nice enough to say, Jim, I don't have time. Why don't you try it? And so I wrote the first science fiction game in Metamorphosis Alpha. And then I wrote the thing about pantheons for clerics and gods, demigods, and heroes, and just started writing for them ever since. And then joined them in 1980. That was 74. And I joined them in 1980 when he could pay my $9,500 salary. Yeah, rich money in those days, boys.
When they hired me aboard in 1980, I think we were being paid 25 or maybe as high as 35 cents above minimum wage, which my memory says was somewhere under $5.
No.
Have to look it up to be sure, but it was TSR was not a high-paying vocation, despite being able to hire teachers away from their part-time jobs.
I think Gary just hired me so I could be his DM on games.
Right.
So, Nick, you had a question for everybody that you wanted to ask?
Well, yeah. I mean, we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons and TSR, which in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably their most popular property, what it's most known for, I would think. And we were talking about the culture back in the day, when it started. And it's kind of in the media zeitgeist now with like Stranger Things, movies like Summer of '84. I was just curious to like how accurate is the depiction of that culture in these the modern media? Like, is it exactly or close enough to how it really was in like the 70s and 80s?
You mean in terms of people gaming or the
behind
the scenes? Because I haven't seen a lot of behind the scenes stuff. The games I think are pretty recognizable, whether it's, Stranger Things or even back in the day, E.T. It's clear they're playing Dungeons and Dragons, though TSR didn't.
In that first scene, yeah.
To say that, and it was my experience, and Jim was actually playing. He was playing with Gary, and he was playing the original parts of the game, but the original games weren't, and I loved them, but they weren't really well written. So there was kind of a real Wild West feeling to the game back in the day, and making up the rules, at least until we started doing the basic and expert sets, where things got a little more easy to understand and a little easier to play, I think. So in terms of that feel, I think there's definitely a Wild West thing going on there with Stranger Things and E.T. and perhaps some of these others that I think is fairly accurate. It was all games tended to be pretty personalized.
Okay, awesome.
I guess I'll jump in to speak to this. I'm old enough that things like Stranger Things, I hate to say it, but it's my kids' generation. They're the ones with those memories. But I think where TSR had the biggest effect on the culture was all of the computer games. I mean, everything that they licensed, its levels, its character classes, you still see it to this day. And those computer games have just infiltrated. They become kind of lifeblood of the society in a way, at least the capillaries. So, yeah, I think that's the way that it has been most influential.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah,
we changed the world, right? Before there was Jim and me and Gary and all the people here, there weren't levels to things. You didn't level up. You didn't have that kind of a video game sensibility of how games were played, how characters progressed, all that kind of stuff. And none of that existed before Gary and Dave and all the other people that were there early created that stuff. And it's, we just have moments in my house where my kids will be here, my wife will be here, we'll see something on TV and we're like, yeah, we did that. Because it's so everywhere now that it's hard not to see its fingerprints. And it's cool. The ironic thing about what Lester said is that TSR had a video game department, an actual computer game department that I worked in with Bruce Nesmith, Keith Angie, and Mikey Price was the overseeing guy there. And they ended up shutting it down because they couldn't figure out what to do with it. They didn't like the customer service aspect of it. We were doing really interesting games. And we had a tiny staff. And there was a day we had moved from downtown into the big great windowless building that they had purchased out there on Sheridan Springs Road. And they came in one day to shut the computer game down, and we were department down. We'd done our first wave of games. We were starting our next wave of games. We had top designers from the design department, like Mark Akers, helping and working on ideas on how we would do this, and it was going to be really revolutionary and stuff. But they couldn't see past just the next week or whatever. And when they came in and they ended up firing Keith. I went back to the art department. I was only part-time in the computer game department. Bruce went into design. I don't remember whether it was Kevin Bloom or Mike Cook. One of those two guys, I think it was. Though it was a shocking thing. It was suddenly they came in and you're shut down. And I was shocked, and I said, well, why? Why are you shutting us down when we're right on the verge of this kind of, cutting edge stuff, and we're about to do some really revolutionary things? And whichever one of those two guys it was said to me, and this is a direct quote, he said, "There will never be any money in computer games."
It's like a $6 billion a year, product.
Now that would be funny and ironic in and of itself, but if you know anything about computer games, you may know that my coworker Bruce Nesmith later went on to be the lead designer and creator of a little game called Skyrim.
Yeah.
Love that game. That was my crack. I love that man.
Clearly, there was never ever going to be any money there.
Yeah, Zeb
So,
Cook. Yeah, okay.
But
I used to be an adventurer, and then I took an arrow to the knee.
But they licensed it, and Pool of Radiance,
Yeah, for my money, those SSI Gold Box games were what really broke through the electronic gaming barrier. Most everything else was first-person shooter, and to this day, it still is. And that was a third-person perspective that very faithfully recreated the D&D experience of generating characters and accumulating spells, and it played like D&D. Highly addictive, and I think that showed that D&D had the chops for electronic gaming. Although you'll never ever replace the pen and pencil dice version of D&D. That's an experience that just can't be replicated electronically, no matter how sophisticated the technology gets. But if you're having a hard time finding 5 or 6 friends to get together every week on the same night to keep a campaign going, the games are a pretty fair substitution for it.
I have a really good friend who's his grown kids, and their spouses were playing Baldur's Gate recently, and they're like, "Can we play D&D with you?" So suddenly he's back DMing D&D for his grown children who had no interest in it before. They were playing the computers game. So now it's feeding feeding back in both directions, which is awesome.
And now the electronic the gateway drug.
Jim?
That's actually for me. I Elder Scrolls, that franchise was where I started. So James, I have a question for you. We're writing a little series together, and you added a line about the GoPro because we needed to have an excuse for them to have a certain piece of tech, which we know looking back as we're writing it in modern times that at the time no one thought they would take off, and now they are. When you wrote that in there, were you channeling Steven's experience with D&D? Oh, it'll never take off?
Maybe I'm just a genius. I don't know.
I'm so humble too.
A little of both, certainly.
Yeah, a little column A, a little column B.
I looked into a lot of things. I mean, everything in Gamma World now has happened. We have lasers, we have plasma beams, we have mutated creatures being made all the time. I mean, it's all real now. So that came out in '76 and '77, and now now it's old fashioned. We have a Temple of Death Ray. I don't know, it's just lucky stuff. I was lucky in those days.
Yeah, the vision. Jim was the guy who said, we should take all this TSR art and make a collectible card game out of it.
There we go. Yes, I did. And Lorraine said,
Magic Gathering came out.
Wizards of the Coast will be dead.
Went, that'll never work.
Yeah, I heard all the time, Wizards of the Coast will be dead in 6 months. And I believe they're having a big anniversary this year, too.
Well, that was two things. First thing is, before we leave the topic of computers entirely, Jim, am I right in thinking that the licensing money that TSR got was huge, a significant portion of the company's income?
No, well, it was about $1.5 million in the first year with SSI.
That's a lot.
It was
back then even more.
Yeah,
it was over $1 million every year from SSI, and unfortunately, upper management said, "We can get more than that," and so they dumped SSI.
Okay.
Another company that promised to give 3 games a year and didn't even do 1 a year.
So we talked about this in the pre-show that, if you look at defining moments from a historical perspective of the genre of fantasy, you have Tolkien, and then the next big one was you guys with D&D. When you were first starting out in the early days of each of your tenures there, were you aware of the changes you were going to be making to culture? Or was it just, sort of it took off because it took off?
Jim, you want to start, or you want me to jump in?
Let's do it in the proper order, Stephen. You're first.
My goal as a player of the games, because I've been playing pretty heavily and obviously teaching and stuff, was I wanted the D&D game to be more accessible to more people, and I was delighted when I got there as an editor, which we called production back in the day. That was kind of a movement within TSR itself in the creative department. People wanted to make an easier to play introductory style game so people could pick it up and you didn't have to necessarily learn it from your friend, which is the way pretty much I think all of us were learning to play D&D or AD&D to that point. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of my personal goal to help do that, and happily the company wanted to do that too. Mostly the creative division wanted to do it, but there was also this movement at the time to try to separate D&D from AD&D for legal reasons, because my memory of it is this, and Jim maybe can correct me, but my memory is that the contention of the company was that Gary created AD&D and Gary and Dave created D&D. So in order not to give Dave royalties from AD&D, they actually had to have a separate game that they could give royalties to Dave Arneson from. That was my take on what they were doing. So there was an ulterior motive in the company for bifurcating the game further rather than just having AD&D. And along with that came the idea, which may have come from us or in the creative division or somewhere else, I don't know, that simplifying and making the game easier to play would be a great goal. And that's how we got Basic and Expert original what they now call Moldvay Cook. And just so you know, that part of that legalistic deal was that they could not say that Zeb Cook or Tom Moldvay were the designers of D&D Basic and Expert. So they were credited as the editors, and the editors, which was us, were credited as production. And that was kind of a weird subterfuge. But our goal was to make the game more accessible to people, and that obviously really worked. It worked well, and it worked fairly quickly. And then by the time I was in the art department, because I left editing because they were talking about firing people, they said they were going to fire anyone that didn't have a related college degree to what they were working on, which was a problem for me because I'd quit college to go work at TSR. So I had to, I still have no degree. So I moved down to the art department. But by the time I was in the art department, they decided to redo that, and we got the Menser set of, Basic through Immortals and that kind of stuff. So that was intentional in terms of what we wanted to do in the company in order to make it more accessible to people. And I think, not to tie in too much to stuff I worked on, but when they decided they were going to advertise in Marvel Comics around 1982, that was also part of that. And because I happened to be there and I was into comics and Jeff D was and Bill Willingham was, we ended up taking over the ad series from the outside agency that was down in Chicago that did the first one and running with that. And between that and the easier game, it really seemed to make the game more accessible and spread it out. And then additionally, so we were aware that was going on, and our goal was to get the game into more people's hands. And then Jim will remember this too. Almost simultaneously with that, we had the Satanic Panic going on. And suddenly there was a lot of attention on the game that wasn't maybe the best publicity in the world, but there is that any publicity is good publicity school. And I think in the end, that probably helped us far, far more than it hurt us.
Yeah, the net result of that was that D&D became more popular than ever.
Exactly. So it was kind of a confluence of all those things adding up, resulting in the goal that I think the whole company wanted, for some for just monetary reasons, but I think Gary wanted lots of players, right, Jim? And that's what all of us wanted. We wanted the most people playing this game as they could, because we thought, well, it was a revolution in gaming, and it was a great thing, and we were really happy to be pushing it forward in that way. So, and the Satanic Panic then just came in and had people going, what's this game about? And wisely, despite 60 Minutes' terrible episode on it, realizing that D&D was a game, and
it's
smart people play D&D.
Yeah, to recognize that D&D was countercultural in the 70s and 80s because of the Satanic Panic, not only because of its effect in the market, both negative and people burning books, but it also becoming popular, but the effect it had on the company itself. And the company leadership was very uncomfortable with the public perceptions of it. And so as creatives, we lived in this sort of a sensitive, tiptoeing kind of relationship with the company, where we had to be very careful about what we designed. We couldn't call them devils and demons, right? We had to call them Beatazu and Tanari and
right. That came later. And when it first started, though, the creative division, which was then in the old Hotel Claire downtown above the Dungeon Hobby Shop, which is a fudge shop now, by the way. Those of us in that building, we were all kind of we were rebels. We were, the rebel geniuses or whatever. We were like, screw them. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. People are loving this. There's no reason we should change anything. And I know poor Jim was one of the people who kind of got caught in the middle sometime in there. But one of my favorite moments of that was one of the big TV preachers was burning books. They were buying the D&D books up en masse and burning them, which was, we were like, well, burn all you want, we'll make more. the late great Don Snow, Dr. Don Snow, what was Don's title, Jim?
Well, he was in sales, so he was like a sales manager.
Right, and his sales manager and marketing, I think, and he had an educational background, and he was very smart, very funny guy. And Don said when reports of these book burnings going on came to Don said, "Gosh, if they'd bought, if they'd come to me, I'd have sold them to him wholesale."
Yeah.
I love Don. What a character he was.
Lester, what was your experience when you first started? Did you realize what kind of changes that it was going to have?
I feel like tangential at this point. I have nowhere near the history that these people have with D&D. And when I started at TSR, most of the projects I worked on were not D&D. Amazing engine materials, and I've mentioned Dragon Dice. Jim came up with the idea that we could actually make trading cards out of dice. We could fit things on there, and I was fortunate enough to be able to design the project. But so for me, Dungeons and Dragons was, of course, entry into the hobby. I've mentioned it being an inspiration for everything I've done since. But I'm just sitting here fascinated listening to the history that I missed out on.
Yeah, we were lucky, weren't we, Jim? I mean, like right place, right time, right skill set.
Yeah, we sure were.
I was still in diapers for the Satanic Panic, but I do remember in the 90s they were freaking out about all the video games for the same reason. And it's funny that you mentioned the Satanic Panic, because James and I have this. So I'm a soldier, and sometimes grunts can be crude in our language. You might think we're from Boston or something. And James has the rule about not wanting to make the moms angry that we butt heads against sometimes. And I think that's probably, for him at least, residual of having to deal with those angry parents in the 80s.
Yeah, it's the truth.
So
is Jim? My memory is, Jim, that you coined the word, the phrase "angry mommies from heck."
No, that wasn't me. That was Bill Connors. Mine was always the angry mother rule, which was easy to remember, and you guys were nice and towed the line with that rule, so that was good. Now, let me just tell you, when I started in '74, I knew it was a cool thing, but it was always find the monster, fight the monster, grab the treasure. Until we did Ravenloft and Dragonlance and El Qadim and even Boot Hill, I realized we really had something when we added stories to the campaigns, and people loved the stories. And when we started doing novels, it got even better, because they would read the novels and that would give them ideas for games. So once we added stories to the mix, it was a huge deal, and I knew we were off and running.
And that had started, somewhat with Gary's Giants and Drow and all that kind of, that set of campaign adventures had kind of a story feeling to them. And then there was a similar feeling in the Slave Pits of the Undercity, which was one of the first things I was editing when I was there. But when Tracy Hickman came in and had modules similar to those, but then came up with the idea for Dragonlance, we had this done. We'd been doing dungeons all these years, right? But we hadn't really done a whole set of modules on dragons, and wouldn't that be a great idea? And the story stuff all flowed out of that and took off, and now people kind of expect that you're going to have a big campaign, and there's going to be kind of this Lord of the Rings almost sweep to things.
Yeah.
Which I think is good in one way, but it's bad in another way. Where I came from, and I know Jim knows Gary had a lot of prepared dungeons. Where I came from, we did a lot of improv on stuff. Our dungeons were maybe not as big, and certainly not as big and deep as Gary's, but we did a lot of like, well, where do you want to go this week? And the players would say, well, what kind of rumors have we heard? And we'd say, well, there's this guy over here that's taken over a wizard's tower, and there's hobgoblins in the woods, and then where the players wanted to go, we would, use the tables in the back of the DMG and our improv ability. Or before the DMG, there were other tables, the Wandering Monster tables and stuff, and just improv a lot of it. So there wasn't nearly as much focus on long campaigns back in the days, and that really did change things. And obviously, Dragonlance was huge. And
let me add one more thing about Dragonlance. For the longest time, TSR wanted to get more girls and women playing the game. It started out 95% male, and we knew that girls read lots more than males did. We really wanted to get them playing, but we didn't find the key until Dragonlance came out and started using females as heroes and villains. And then we started getting tons of girls and women playing the game. So we really lucked out. We didn't even know to do it on purpose, but it worked really well for us and added a lot of females to the game.
Well, I think some of that
well for
Tracy
people like
working
Steve.
with his wife Laura, and her influence on his work and his gaming, I think, really showed through in Dragonlance. And then Margaret, when adding Margaret into the mix, then obviously we're getting a stronger point of view than we were getting in a lot of early D&D stuff. Although obviously there were people like Gene Wells, who was on staff and kind of a weird in between management and creative division stuff. And there were women and obviously my wife and two of my former girlfriends that played and stuff. But yeah, adding the story. It's funny, women like stories more than they like stabby.
Yeah, there we go. Luster, you had a point to bring up?
Oh, just drawing more females into the game was perfect for people like Steve, who was playing.
Right, because that 5%,
right?
Jim was talking about, there were 95% male, and the 5%, I dated that other 5.
Oh, there we go. Probably all of you.
The interesting thing about Dragonlance for me is that it was sort of a rescue project. They had contracted somebody else to write the first books who dropped the ball, and
Yes.
they basically threw Tracy and Margaret at it to save it from itself.
Right, which was a great decision considering it was Tracy's damn idea in the first place.
Yeah, Margaret had never written a book before, I believe. So she was
just a writing moment.
I can be a scribe here. I can sort of generate that. And so Tracy sort of painted the picture and she wrote it all down.
Right. Well, they would get together and they'd have all these meetings and that kind of together stuff and work on it together. And then Margaret would do the writing, and then Tracy would feedback it, and it worked out beautifully. I mean, obviously, it's done very, very well for them as well as the company. Yeah, but the company at the time, my memory is that the company didn't even want to do the project. The idea of doing like 12 modules about dragons was.
Why am I not surprised?
That's not quite right. Gary was doing Greyhawk at the time, and he wouldn't let other people do Greyhawk products.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Which was very frustrating for your whole department, for the editors and designers, because they were there ready to do stuff. So they put up the Dragonlance proposal, and Larry Elmore did some terrific prototype art, and the Brian Bloom and Kevin Bloom couldn't say no. They realized it was such a cool deal that they had to say, go ahead and develop it.
Right. Yeah. Thank God for Larry. Larry did some amazing work and definitely helped carry projects like that in a way that, honestly, Brian was a gamer, but Kevin was not, so far as I know. And Gary obviously created this whole thing, but he was very focused on trying to do his own stuff. So in order to get the approval for a project like that, you had to engage them in a way that was outside of what their own little fiefdoms were. And that was so much easier to do with art than it was with Tracy Hickman sitting down and trying to explain to him. Or Lawrence Schick or Alan Hammock or whoever was still there above us at that point. I think it was probably still Lawrence. But But boy, yeah, having an Elmore art piece is like, oh yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on another point that made D&D so culturally ubiquitous. The most amazing illustrators with Easley and Elmore and Lockwood and Rupo
Parkinson
and
and Jim
Fields,
Holloway and
Parkinson.
Parkinson, and oh man, just
Errol Otis and
incredible artists that gave life to those fantasy worlds.
right, and that was almost the improvement in TSR's art department. It wasn't a fluke, but it was almost accidental in the sense that those of us that were there then in the art department, which was me and Errol and David Force was around and Holloway, I think we had at that point, and Jim Rosloff had been there for a good long while. God love all those guys. They're great people and good artists. But Dragon Magazine, the recruiting tool of Dragon Magazine out there, having them looking for artists to do the Dragon Magazine calendars at the time, which was what got a submission from Larry somehow. I don't remember. You'd have to ask Larry how. But Larry sent in a piece for this for the magazine calendar, and I had trouble with Kevin Bloom in many areas, but God love him, he saw Larry's piece of art and thought, this guy's amazing. We need to hire this guy, and was willing to basically do whatever it took and throw, I don't even know how much money, but a good chunk of money at Larry to get Larry to come to work for TSR. But once Larry was here, Larry was friends with Jeff Easley. And then, so that snowballed there, and then it just spread out from there. And, to Clyde Caldwell and Keith Parkinson eventually. And we had Tim Truman for a while. Tim Truman and I did a Dragonlance comic pitch. One of many times I tried to get TSR to do comics that they said no. So if you go to my website, sdsullivan.com, and type in Dragonlance comics, you'll find the 2-page Dragonlance pitch that Tim Truman and I did before we even knew who the Dragonlance characters were. The company hadn't settled on, Tanis and Tasselhoff and all those kind of people. So it became TSR. Good talent attracts more good talent, and TSR made some good choices early on. They got lucky in a couple of places, and it was an amazing, in the creative division, it was an amazing place to work. In the management, well, not always.
I have all these scars right here I could show you.
I know you do, Jim. So a lot of that is from throwing yourself bodily between the creative division and management.
Yes.
So when I come, I'm writing stuff with James right now, and when I need to do research on anything fantasy tying back to the folklore and all of that, I have this amazing thing called Google, or lots of source materials that have created largely by people inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. But you guys didn't have that when you were doing your research and prepping your games. So did TSR just keep a crazy, wicked, amazing library? I threw in Wicked for you, Stephen. Or how did you guys go about doing your research for this stuff?
It's called a library.
Yeah, we went to a library. I went to every library in Lower Wisconsin when I did Deities and Demigods. But we did have a pretty cool library, but it was filled with World War II stuff.
The creative division at above the Hotel Claire, I think everyone in the third floor, which was the designers and Devo and editors, all of us, I think, had these huge personal libraries of books related to the subject that we would find at library sales or down at Bread Loaf bookstores or at the smoke shop, which carried books and magazines that Jim mentioned. And so a lot of us, it was like, if you needed something, you would say, hey, what does someone know about? And then Tom Mulvey would say, oh yeah, I've got a book on that. Or someone else would.
Or John Pickens had books on everything.
Right. John, I was roommates with John for 2 years. John had an amazing collection of books, far more than Well, maybe not more than I have now, but far more than most of us had. And also a great memory for, the fact that he had this stuff and where it could
Yeah.
be. So a lot of it was shared information from our personal libraries. And then I'm sure people did what Jim did and went down to the library and stuff too. But a lot of it was just massed information that we all brought to the job. That's the way I remember it anyway.
Well, you have to know John Pickens to understand what an astounding thing it is that Steve lived with him for 2 years.
John and I were hired on the same day.
Oh, really?
And started at the same day, and that's how we ended up being roommates. And it was great because I was out in Boston, had interviewed at Gen Con in Parkside, and literally drove 24 hours back to get home. Got a call when I was home, said it was Lawrence Schick who'd interviewed me, and he said, and I said, picked up the phone. I haven't had any sleep, or I slept maybe for a couple of hours or something. It was like, oh, hey, Lawrence, I just got home. And he was like, well, how soon can you get back here?
Oh.
And I had nothing. I had no connections in Wisconsin at all. But I discovered that he had hired someone else, and I got in touch with John. And John was from Valparaiso and had been up to Gen Cons since probably Gen Con 1 or something like that. He'd been in the area. So thank God for John Pickens, because he had all the connections. By the time I called him, he was like, oh, yeah, I found this apartment. I need a roommate. And I was like, oh, I'm there, man. This is the easiest thing that's ever going to happen to me in my life.
Cool.
So, yeah, and so we roomed together for a couple of years. It was interesting. I love John. He's a great guy and amazing encyclopedic knowledge.
Yeah.
And also for you trivia fans, he and I were hired the same day. My number was 95. I always like to think he was 96. When I left TSR, I was 35 or 32 or something like that. John stayed at TSR long enough that he got from 95 in seniority to number 1 in seniority. He was the employee at TSR the longest of anyone. Longer than Gary. So that was pretty cool too. So personal libraries, that's my explanation. And that's my excuse for having way too many books still.
Was that your experience, Dave and Lester?
Yes. I mean, most of the people in our profession are prolific readers and have very large libraries. A lot of us have been through postgraduate education and have accumulated a lot of literature in the course. Lester was perhaps one of the most erudite among the entire staff in terms of just general knowledge of many things and literary strength and thoughtful analysis. He really brought a lot of depth to whatever he wrote.
Oh, thanks for saying that. Yeah, in my case, I think it was just avid reader, and my strength was really horror. But part of it was too, I spent 8.5 years in a factory, and as I said, once I joined the National Guard, that got me started in college. I had 3 children by then. Had really been invested in the Bible ever since I'd been a teenager. So there was that literary connection, and started college pre-med, switched to English. Was learning to be an English teacher when the job came up in gaming. My MOS in the Guard was I was a battalion aid station medic, so it was just a lot of disparate things bouncing around in my head. It was actually the medical knowledge that got me my first job in gaming.
Okay. So I had many fascinating conversations about scripture.
Well, you talked about the satanic scare. even after that was over with, I remember I got my first job. I'm writing game materials and just feeling such a joy from taking part in other people's fun. Even without being at their tables, I knew how important things like Dungeons and Dragons had been to my group of friends meeting on Friday nights. You'd work. I mentioned being in the factory. You'd work all week long, and life problems and everything, and then on Friday nights get together with friends and just have this joyous time together building these stories. So to be able to work on those materials meant that I was kind of in everybody's basements on Friday night, helping them along. And so that I'm getting that joy out of it. But my pastor at the time was talking about America's sinful preoccupation with fun. And I thought, man, you never read the Screw Tape Letters at all, did you? That was something C.S. Lewis had to say about that joy is from heaven. So I sound like a religious fanatic at the moment, and I'm atheist now, but boy, yeah, deep in the study of that. I think that's where the philosophy started. Anyway, thank you, David, for those words.
So since you mentioned, your different locations in the town, what was the reaction of the locals to you guys? Because, it's small towns generally, they have a lot in common with each other, regardless of where in the country they are. And I imagine that they would kind of look at, those weird TSR boys or something, because the land of make-believe in a rural setting, you don't think they go hand in hand.
Let me start on that. They loved TSR. At one time, we had 386 people who were hitting the bars and hitting the restaurants every day. So we were a gigantic income stream for Lake Geneva in general. And they didn't have any problem with the weirdness of TSR. I can remember going to the next door pub and everybody knew that we were from TSR, and they bought us drinks and they were nice to us. And the people in Lake Geneva really liked us a lot. And that's kind of unusual because Lake Geneva is a tourist town where all the prices go up every summer to attract the Illinois people. So yeah, I think we were well received all over the county.
I agree with that. Folks love TSR, and it's because of our effect on the economy, and we were patronizing everything. I mean, we probably kept the bookstore afloat for a good long while, and we kept the deli afloat. There was when Sue Wing opened his own restaurant there, some of us were eating there like 4 days a week.
Yeah.
So and the next door pub, and just there were a ton of places, and people liked to see us. And I think it probably helped that they were and are a tourist town. So they're used to people flooding in that are far more obnoxious than anyone at TSR ever was.
Yeah, really.
Growing up in a tourist town, I'm familiar with the type, and I bet your town has a party when you leave on vacation. Types. Okay.
We'd refer to the downtown area as the M zone, M for moron during the summer. We knew every way to drive around the downtown area to get past it.
It was a sad, sad day for the art department when TSR moved us from our second floor overlook of Main Street in the summer, where there were an amazing variety of people, some of whom were very attractive and wearing very few clothing, and moved us from there into a completely windowless area above TSR's warehouse that I used to call the Great Windowless Space. But it was like, if you ever want to see a bunch of sad artists, move them from someplace they have a great view into someplace where all they've got to look at is white walls and each other.
These guys were terrible. They would shout, "Hey, look out there!" and they'd grab their binoculars and they'd look at the hot babes walking down the sidewalk. And it just happened that the other side of the street from the building had this big arcade place. So there were hot babes walking in and out of that place all the time.
We're only a block from the beach, man.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm. In fact, lots of us used to eat our lunches by the beach so we could see the view all for an hour.
Yeah. I wasn't there back in those early days, but after talking to Steve Winter and Bruce Nesmith and some of the other old guard, if you ever want to have a 2 hours of hijinks, stories, get those guys on this program with you.
Really.
They will have you laughing hysterically with the stuff they used to do.
Yeah, we were young and we had some disposable income and a lot of free time, and we're all, not to brag too much, all pretty much whip smart, and that's a recipe for hijinks right there.
Mm-hmm.
And hijinks included having to break into the building because we were all on the time clock back in the Bone Ages, and couldn't get into the building because whoever was supposed to have come and unlocked the doors did not come and unlock the doors. So we were all there when we were supposed to be working, standing outside the doors, waiting for, I don't know, one of the Blooms or one of the maintenance people, Dan Matheson, somebody to open the building. And at some point, some people who shall remain nameless decided it would be really easy to just get up the fire escape and go in and open the door from the inside so we could all start working rather than standing outside in the cold, as I remember it.
What dedication?
Do you remember that day, Jim? You probably weren't. Were you in the hotel then?
I was in the building, but I quickly went to the LRP building.
Right. Yeah, and later that day, Dan Matheson, who was this big bear of a man with a big ZZ Top beard, great guy, good gamer, came over and he was like, if we ever find out who actually broke into this building, they're going to be fired.
Oh no!
So you better make sure whoever did this never does anything like this again.
Great.
So,
we have no memory of who it was that actually did this, Dan.
Yeah, right.
Plausible deniability to this day. As much as we could probably keep going for hours because I'm having fun listening to these stories, I did promise Jim I'd keep it close to an hour. So I'm going to see if we could find more questions and maybe a future episode. But to wrap it
up, by the way,
what's that?
You failed miserably.
I know we're at an hour in 32 minutes.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you each a chance to tell me what your favorite memory of TSR was as a way to close on a high note.
Ooh.
Oh man.
Mm-hmm.
Too many.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah, you had to ask a hard question last. Well done, moderator.
I just assume there are so many good memories you could just pick one at random.
Yeah.
I will share the lunchtime gaming as sort of a classic, wonderful memory of TSR. When we were in that building on Sheridan Springs, we'd all run down to Pick and Save, which was sort of down the hill out the back door, get some lunch, come back up, and you name the game. We play it for everything from Cosmic Encounter to TSR games like Boot Hill to just dozens of games. And Jim was always coming up and saying, only an hour. And of course, by that time, we had been playing like an hour and a half, going on 2 hours. Boy, we had great times. And just as gaming professionals, it was like going to the athletic club, right? Working out and getting our game muscles in shape. But I'll never forget lunchtime at TSR as just a wonderful, wonderful time to be there.
Okay. What about you, Lester?
Well, when you mentioned the lunch hours, my understanding was take your hour for lunch. As long as you were here to play games, you could have an extra half hour that was paid. So that's what I thought was going on. I didn't realize we were just gaming past our allotted time.
Great.
Yeah,
You probably didn't have to punch out for your lunch hours either. The time
wow.
clock, what a curse that was. There's stories there.
Well, we were encouraged to play a lot of different things, not just TSR materials, to try to make sure that we were, I guess, well fertilized with other ideas. So I'm going to say it was the 2-year campaign that Bill Slavisek ran with West End Games Star Wars, and
Nice.
somehow my old, worn out, failed Jedi ended up marrying Princess Leia.
Nice.
So there you go. I'm going to sound as nerdish as possible
There we
by
go.
admitting that.
Take that, Anakin.
Bill ran a great campaign.
What about you, Steve?
Oh boy. Just being with the people at TSR, whether it was when I was on staff there for those close to 4 years, or the many years after that where I was in regularly freelancing, working on my comic strip, Twilight Empire, on Dragon Magazine or whatever. There's just so much great stuff, and so many people that are like family to me from that era. And like I said, probably 2-3 generations of people at TSR that are very close to. In terms of work, I think I'll never forget working on Basic and Expert, getting up before dawn, driving down to Beloit to patch press the printers, working feverishly, rewriting and editing and stuff as the type was being set and sent to print. And that was at least 2 days and may have been as much as a week. And we left before dawn and we got back after sunset. That was amazing. But probably the most fun was some of the gaming, as these guys have mentioned. Lawrence Schick, when Call of Cthulhu first came out, we were all big Lovecraft fans. Lawrence Schick ran a Call of Cthulhu game that was set in modern day Lake Geneva and environs. And that was a blast. We had a great time while that lasted. And related to that, that Halloween that the game was running, Steve Winter and I decided we were going to do a driving tour on Halloween night of all the places in Lawrence's game, which ended up with us stomping through a cemetery and sneaking through the woods at Snake Road, where all those mansions are in the front of the on the edge of Lake Geneva, to a place that we had burned down to the ground in the game, which Lester will recognize as an old tactic of Cthulhu for me now. And discovering that the house we had burned down was actually being completely rebuilt after some kind of catastrophe.
Oh my!
So that's a pretty wonderful memory, and just working with people like Jim and Les and Dave and all the it's the friendships, TSR and friendships.
All right, finally, James.
My first Gen Con was amazing to me. I had no idea people did that stuff. And so I was seeing game auctions, I was seeing people playing spaceship games, and was seeing Napoleonics. It was just stunning, and it was a 3-day affair, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, and it only got better year after year. So I think the big Gen Cons were my real favorite times. And towards the end there, TSR demanded that you worked 40 hours. And so I would be naughty and I would tell them that I was working at the auction, because no upper management wanted to sit in the auction and listen and watch people work. So I would work like 20-hour real hours and just tell them I'd worked 40 hours at the auction, and I got away with it. It was pretty sweet.
We won't tell if you won't tell, James.
All right, thanks.
That's right.
All right. And as we wrap this up, James was gracious enough to sponsor this episode with his short story collection, Wolfoid. So, James, you want to tell the listeners what that is real quick?
I think I can. Let me see if I have that book somewhere. Oh,
and while he's looking for it, he recently released that in large print as well at the request of some of his fans.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because I can't read small print anymore.
I was going to say, Jim, you're going to have to find that book quickly, or I'm going to grab one of mine and hold it up.
Please, Stephen, grab one of yours and hold it up. No, that's not it.
No, I thought you meant my book.
Oh, Wolfoid, I did it. That's very funny. No.
Yeah, if you don't pitch yours in time.
I'm sorry, Jim. I don't have that book of yours. I've got others. I've got a bunch of fast forward ones.
What was that book you showed? You'll have to tell us about that too sometime, Steve.
Yeah, Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors.
Yeah. Wolfoid for me is 40 years of short stories, science fiction and fantasy, and you can get it on Amazon or Bookapee.
Awesome.
And he took it wide, so I think it's on Barnes & Noble and all the other places as well.
Yes.
Pretty sure.
So there you have it.
So what was yours, Stephen? Since you showed the cover, if you want to show that real quick too?
Sure.
And how do
Sorry,
you
Jim, I didn't mean to outfox you there.
Okay, buddy. How do you get that book, Steve?
You can pick it up on Amazon, or in theory, libraries and places can order it, but it's available on Amazon and in Kindle and in print form. And it's a nice, thick horror book in the tradition of Hammer and Universal Horror.
You should definitely look up Bookapee, Stephen.
I should. You and I will have to talk about that, and I'll find out how it works.
It works really easy. It sells a PDF. At a good price, and there's thousands of people looking for new books. So
cool. Amazon's great, but the trouble with it is signal to noise ratio, right? So anything where people will focus more on your books, like the one you're using, Jim, is probably a great idea.
And so for those of you listening at home who aren't creatives, Bookapee, and I'll link to that as well. It's a good place to find books that you might not have noticed because, like he said, the signal to noise ratio. So I've found some authors there. I'm like, how did I not know this guy existed? And found some pretty cool books. So
and it's cheap too, so it's well worth it.
Cool.
Not cheap.
It's great you've done so many stories over the years. It's great that you've collected them all.
Yeah, indeed. So you get, and anytime I can get money twice for the same piece of work, I'm gonna do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I collected a bunch of my stories recently too, so I hear you, man. Right there with you, buddy.
So this is the part of the interview, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books, so do your part. And with that being said, we're going to go round robin. And Stephen, how can listeners and viewers find you at home?
You can find me in StephenDSullivan.com, or if you have trouble spelling Stephen, just SDSullivan.com. I'm also under my own name on Facebook.
Saying that will be linked in the show notes. And what about you, Lester? How can listeners and viewers find you at home?
LesterSmith.com.
You make it easy for me. I appreciate that, sir. And David, so I know you're not in the game anymore. Are you active in gaming communities?
Just private games. I'm now in legal business development. I work for one of the largest law firms in the country. So I have gotten far from the gaming industry. Occasionally, Jim invited me to write a short story for him not too long ago, and I did that. But my involvement in the gaming industry is just on the private side now.
That's still valid. All right, James, what about yourself? How can they find you?
Facebook is the only way right now, but you're working on a website for us.
We are. I got to find someone who can do the computery stuff way better than either one of us.
There we go.
I know this is going to shock most people, but I think James might actually be better at technology than I am. And that's not saying much.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a silly statement right there. As you can note, it took me 6 minutes to get on this thing.
All right. And you can find us, dear listener, on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the bits, shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the Twitters. We have our email, Blasters and Blades podcast @gmail.com. For professional purposes only, people, we have our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. And last but not least, we have Madam Stabby Stab's Instagram, Twitter, and email. And if you want to send hate mail, she will read it. She will make you cry when she replies, but that's on you and between you and your maker. So with that being said, you can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-blades, where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on. These episodes aren't free to produce, and we appreciate your patronage. If you want to support the show more directly, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section this for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink until coffee pours out of their eyeballs. And with that being said, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, Steven, Lester, David, James, thank you for coming on, man. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I might have to have you guys back just to keep this conversation going, because I was just sitting back laughing. It was a pleasure.
I'm up for that. See you soon.
All right. And with that,